Welcome everyone to the Essex County Field Naturalist Club February 2021 meeting. My name is Corey Reno, the current club vice president. Thank you for joining this presentation over Zoom. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest, Dr. Catherine Febria and her students at the University of Windsor Healthy Headwaters Lab. They'll be presenting on the work, some of which will be the Marianne Girling Nature Reserve, a lot of you will be familiar with, and just work across Essex County in general and beyond. This will be a pretty exciting presentation. Looking forward to it tonight, and I just want to thank Dr. Febria for joining us. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation over, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. We're super excited. I see familiar names in the squares, and you're definitely a group that we would have loved to meet sooner had it not been for the pandemic. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Windsor, and my lab opened in 2019. And even despite the pandemic, I have some stories to just share with you about the work we've just begun here in Essex County, as well as kind of abroad across southwestern Ontario. I will also mention, I said, I'm going to take you to New Zealand for a few slides and just tell you and just situate you with some of the work that informs the work that we're doing here, just so you can sort of see where the vision is going. And I hope to end today with just a couple of really, just an invitation to continue to connect and build partnerships with the students and our team. Connecting with this club is really strategic and exciting for a lot of us because nature is the way we relate to the world. So it's just a real privilege and honor to be here today. So I'm going to share my screen. I was told, we have a time to give a presentation. So it's a mixture of some of the research that informs, but more so the stories that have come from it and the learning that we're still continuing to just uncover in this journey. So if you just give me a moment, I will start my presentation. And that looks okay? Is that working for people? Great. So today's talk is about accelerating nature-based solutions in the Great Lakes Basin. And it is, I'll take you to different places, but I really did want to situate ourselves and just express my gratitude for all of the different places that I've been privileged to work on. I'm an immigrant settler. I was born in the Philippines and I grew up on the shores of Lake Ontario. So Canada and the Philippines are my home, but I most recently relocated from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I've just been really lucky to come back to the Great Lakes where most of my family continues to live, and where we've really started to just create a new type of lab at the Great Lakes Institute for Ecosystem Research, focusing on stream ecology, but also integrating it with community and social dimensions. So if you, just for the snapshot of what our lab is about, we are definitely focused on freshwater science, ecology, and we use it and we look at it through the lens of how can we use science to connect land, water, and people. I'm trained as a small stream ecologist, in microbes and nutrients and things. And so a lot of the research is used towards trying to inform solutions to bigger problems. So if we can deal with small streams before we get to the Great Lakes, that's key to addressing some of these downstream challenges. A lot of the science that I've developed, particularly in the last 10 years, have been really focused on being actionable, and that knowledge is produced in partnership with different experts. And given that it is very much an ecology lab, I really have spent a lot of time thinking about how do we embrace the social infrastructure and partnerships to implement research in the real world. And so I'll give you a number of examples to that end. And so a lot of it really is thinking about the Great Lakes. And, when I think about the Great Lakes, we often think about, the enormity of these systems. But my relationship with these large lakes really is with the land. So this is a restored wetland in the Don Valley in the city of Toronto from years ago with my eldest at the time. She's little there. But, when I think about, these large lakes, I often think about their connection to the trees and how, there's a children's book there that's called like Trout Are Made of Trees. And it really really kind of emphasizes the connection of the land with our waterways, and how water bodies like wetlands offer so many benefits and services for a number of things. In this case, stormwater infrastructure, or flooding mitigation, biodiversity, and those sorts of things. It really does align with this year, which is the launch of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And there's a hashtag Generation Restoration. And it really is about, it's really trying to amplify and create a really grassroots or ground up movement towards scaling restoration. And the emphasis for a lot of the efforts here is that, as the global challenges around climate change and loss of biodiversity is really linked to, amplifying local efforts and accelerating those. And one of the main challenges that this is really focused on is the fact that we're losing a lot of topsoil due to how humans have impacted our landscapes. There's been multiple, especially with the pandemic, there's lots of different reports about the status of our planet. Climate change is one of them. And there's growing studies and growing research that's just reminding us that as the world gets hungrier, the land is getting exhausted, and that, we need to coordinate our actions to stop soil erosion. And if we can deal with addressing soil erosion, that's kind of our way or path to addressing freshwater degradation. Also, in the last year, you might have seen reports from organizations like the UN IPBES, the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services platform, of which I am a part of that community. And we conducted global syntheses of biodiversity around the world, and to headlines like, humans are responsible for a loss of millions of species, or a million species, was one of those notable findings from that work. And so, as much as, I think about these bigger problems, the approach that the research that we do is really kind of at that local level, and really from an ecologist lens. So I kind of wanted to throw back to one of my favorite articles, and it's this essay by Arthur Tansley. It's the foundational essay where where he defines ecosystem. And what I've always really, even as a student, years ago, trying to understand or figure out what kind of ecologist I was, it was very clear that this was one of these foundational things that I read. And it's in Arthur's essay, he writes, these ecosystems, or ecosystems as we may call them, are of the most various kinds of sizes, which range from the universe as a whole down to the atom. These systems we isolate mentally are not only included parts of larger ones, but they overlap, interlock, and interact with one another. And further on saying the isolation is partly artificial, but it's the only possible way in which we can proceed. So that was in 1935. I thought that was really, that still resonated with me as a student, thinking about how do we understand the overlapping and the interlocking, and almost 100 years later, I think we're really moving towards the idea of trying to understand how these are all interconnected. And so headwater streams and river systems, waterway networks, agricultural drains, they're all part of this interconnected system that I find incredibly interesting. And these headwater ecosystems are really essential and crucial for a lot of our biodiversity and ecosystem health challenges in the Great Lakes. As you know, these small waterways, of which there are few of natural ones in Essex, they're critically important for a lot of our invertebrate communities, birds, as you know, sources of organic matter that end up really fueling the food web and fish downstream. And equally, fish, as you know, come up our agricultural drains and waterways. And so they are refuges and key sites and nursery and spawning habitats. So they're incredibly important, and knowing that they're connected is what some of the foundational, one of the more foundational parts of our lab. But we try to make and approach our science from the lens of how can we use this knowledge to connect and make it actionable. So actionable science is one of the words we use, and what is it? It's a lot. I hear it a lot, especially in our in different spaces, thinking about how our communities are socio-ecological systems, but you can think of it as collaboration among scientists and lawyers, indigenous communities, stakeholders, different people that have different lenses, that they all have a relevant view to environmental decision making, such as conservation. And in ecology, we also call this translation ecology. So it's an approach where you intentionally embed the processes for ecologists, to talk with different knowledge holders, decision makers. And that's all part of the beginning of this research and ongoing way. And it really is to help improve decision making. And so, we spend a lot of time in our lab in the community and having circles and listening to ensure that, the science that we're doing in the real world reflects real world gradients and can help inform real world solutions. So this is, a part of a larger body of methodologies that scientists, more and more scientists are embedding and taking on, called co-production or knowledge co-production and sustainability research. And there's always a couple key things, like, we don't do our research in a lab. We don't only, we use our lab, but a lot of the places that we're trying to interrogate are in nature. And so we spend a lot of time understanding context. We do, participating, everybody in our group is engaged in some local community related to, sustainability or food or water or nature, and really understanding the local context and place is important. We take a pluralistic view, so we want to make sure that it's not just the scientist view that's incorporated in the design, but really understanding the farmer, really understanding, an urban dweller, depending on the issue, understanding those issues and challenges, barriers, and enablers. And that all really helps us be very clear about the research that we do. And then we always, we talk about things being a work in progress, because the more we try and learn something, we might refine things further. And one of the reasons why we love to keep interacting with people is that they understand if something changes or doesn't go according to plan, or it might sound like a failure or whatever. There have been many occasions where a farmer has helped me interpret that data, and they'll say, yep, that makes complete sense because of this weather pattern or that event. And so there really is part of this broader team that we engage. So what does this look like in person? And for this part of the talk, I wanted to take you to New Zealand. It was a pleasure and a privilege to be there for 5 years, part of a freshwater ecology research group, but I really played the role of directing a science program in the community. It was funded by Agricultural Farming Trust. They really wanted some solutions to freshwater and conservation challenges in lowland Canterbury Plains. And so, often when I tell people I'm from Canterbury, they think of hobbits and braided river ecosystems and the most beautiful, bird sightings, and all of those things are true, except for maybe the hobbits, but like their sets are, there's just lots of hills that are, they look very much like different places, but the landscape is well and truly gorgeous. And I invite everyone to visit as soon as we are able to. And so, yeah, and while that landscape is true and that is stunning, the reality of the human settled landscape is exactly very similar, shockingly very similar to a lot of places, including here in the Lake Erie Basin and watersheds, where the agricultural land use and intensification of it has led to, just you can see here's the city of Christchurch in gray. There's a couple of waterways that have high nutrients and eutrophication blooms, some waterways and channels that have been channelized, buried, tile drained. So a lot of the same issues. They have invasive plants that are choking these drains. At this public discourse and debate around the function of agricultural drains and intensification of agriculture and how we can find a sustainable freshwater and farming future. So that sounds all familiar. When I came back and I was sort of talking about these ideas, I was really surprised at how, talking to our farmers, how it is a lot of the similar challenges. So the way that we went about this in this project called CAREX, I'll sort of explain to you how our co-production process rolled out. Much like Essex, the natural spaces are sort of scattered. A lot of the waterways are drained and tiled. And so we went with it with a toolbox sort of approach, saying, there's not one solution, to invest in nature. Like, how can we, if it is a farming landscape, how can we embed that as our science, and how do we offer different tools, and can we test them so that we can, empower individual decision makers to pick and choose what works for their context. So there's the edge of field. We did some of the first bioreactor trials in Canterbury, New Zealand, and they were pioneered and first studied here in Southern Ontario. And so these are adding wood chips to intercept with tile drains to enhance the natural processes that allow microbial communities to, mineralize or to assimilate the nitrate and release it into nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. We talked about riparian planting. It is one of the most common tools is to plant along the waterways edges. So we wanted to revisit that from an ecologist lens and think about functions and traits. And then there are things like channel margins. So as you know, on the other, well, you may or may not know, but Nature Conservancy on the other side of the border has supported quite a lot of research with Jennifer Tank's lab on two-stage channels that try to recreate natural floodplains to allow organic matter to build up on the benches, to allow for greater flood capacity, and also introduce biodiversity. And then finally, work in streams. So trying to recreate some sort of natural features in agricultural drains and see if that would too enhance not only biodiversity, but ecosystem functions like nutrient uptake and E. coli or water quality functions. So, the umbrella of CAREX, the Canterbury Waterway Rehabilitation Experiment, involved 23 landowners at the start and more as each year went on. We were able to do this research across nearly 10 kilometers of waterway, privately owned and worked farms. Our toolbox were 14 different things, and we had graduate students and a team of scientists working together, and several different, government, industry, and Indigenous partners alongside, because they were all across the region, all under this one umbrella of CAREX. And so there's still information about that online, and much of that work continues in different forms today. But I wanted to give you one example of how this type of approach allowed us to amplify and accelerate the increase of sort of nature-based solutions and conservation on farm. So this is an agricultural drain. It's in Canterbury, New Zealand, in the Silver Stream catchment. And so much like a lot of our drains, there's an invasive weed growing in there. Like the arrow is pointing to the water, but you can't quite see it because there's an invasive plant, including some Ontario migrants as well. I think we had some pondweed and everything that just caused blockage problems. And it's a management regime, dredging and bankside dredging, that allows these invasive plants to continue to proliferate. So it's sort of like it distributes the fragment onto the bank, and then because these are naturally good at invading, those fragments kind of grow further and more vigorous. And so it's this what used to be a small maintenance problem and fix has become this positive feedback loop of ever more dredging, and that's caused bank erosion and all sorts of things. And so, we were tasked by the farmer to try and find solutions to these waterways and use this as an example for scaling solutions across the region. So we pulled back, first thing we really wanted to do a number of habitat assessments that include biodiversity as well as water quality. You can see on the left that there was, at least easily a meter to two of dredged sediment on one bank and then an eroding bank on the right. And so it was really, the status quo simply wasn't enough. We engaged the local communities involved with riparian planting, Te Ara Kakariki, and they helped organize families and communities to come out and do the planting with us. And we decided to pick plants that we thought had a good chance at outcompeting the weeds. So we picked them based on their traits. And in this case, the native Carex, Carex secta, was positioned at 1 meter buffer, 1 meter distances on both sides, and you can see the community coming out. We also decided that on the left, which is where the sun was coming out, that we would plant higher trees that would have a great likelihood of shading over the waterway. And so we wanted to test this hypothesis that plants could outcompete and shade out the invasive bank-based emergent weeds. And so after 2 years, we had a mixture of native plants, and we also helped, part of the infrastructure there was we co-wrote grants with our farmer partners to make sure that the only thing that they contributed was moving of their fences, and grants helped pay for those plants. And we worked with, we co-developed them and presented to council and things like that to say, this is our experiment, this is what we're going to try. And that's why on the right side, you can see not a lot of native, it's a narrower buffer. And that was our contingency plan and compromise for saying, if ever you need to come in with a dredge, if all else fails, at least one side, will definitely be able to access for dredging if you need it. And so, over time, this is me and the PhD student, Dr. Katie Collins, who now is a national science manager for agricultural freshwater restoration with the federal government. And this is her PhD research where she trialed 7 different options for outcompeting the weeds. And in the end, nature won. That was the solution that was the most sustainable, most cost effective. The cost of investing in the plants and maintenance for 3 years years evened out with the annual cost of dredging after 10. So a farmer also would agree that this looks better. It's sustainable. You can see there's no invasive plants in the middle. And by year 2, we had a lot of those plants on the left bank already self-seeding. And so the ground cover was beginning to naturally fill without any of our involvement. So that was that's one example of 9 waterways that we engaged. And to be honest, there was also one or two sites where they did nothing, and we well and truly needed the negative control, because we wanted to ensure that the changes that we were making were due to things we tried, and not just because of happenstance or serendipity. And so that was also really effective in this case. So I just wanted to, use this example to show you that, it's possible to bridge theory and practice, particularly in agriculturally impacted landscapes. This is another one of our PhD students, Dr. Brandon Guller, who trialed the bioreactors. We were able to work with the local drain superintendents to put onion bags filled with wood into the drain, just to test whether or not, how much carbon do you need to, throw in. If we could simulate tree cover, how much do you need to actually stimulate enough nitrogen removal? How much, and as a proof of concept to inform things like the bioreactor. And then, of course, Katie was really passionate about science communication, and because she was working with plants, it was a wonderful way to get people out and do farm walks to show and simulate and explain the outcome of her research. So I invite you to, if this is at all of interest, you never know, we do just dedicate our resources to having free available tips for the public to use. And so there's a website and a download site where you can, download individual, I think there's more than up to 50 newsletters and tip sheets about the toolbox and the story of our research. Even my, annoying radio voice on Radio New Zealand, and you can hear from the partners and the farmers involved in that work. And by the end of 5 years, the real success isn't so much the science but seeing things like this wetland, which was at the top of that. So the pictures that I showed you was from this very photo point. But behind us was this farmer that converted a hectare of their farmlands. We were able to co-write and secure more grants to fill in all those spots, get a federal government industry partner to build a boardwalk through the wetland, and it became our outdoor classroom. We had other scientists who studied microbial, contamination, and they use these sites to uncover, that sediment traps in place, and other nature-based infrastructure like wetlands were really useful for UV irradiation to deal with some of the E. coli challenges, as well as, looking at other co-benefits. One of the native plants, Manuka, as you might know, is one of the highly prized honey in the global honey market. And it turned out to be one of the best riparian plants we could find in our wetland that also was taking up nitrogen from the soil. So we, in this framework, and there's a paper that's just been published on our lab website about this very story, where we looked at, the number of different partners, how much did they invest, and what kinds of things were we able to accomplish. And so it's the idea that one of the key learnings was that, partnerships are able to achieve co-benefits. There's never going to be a perfect solution or experiment. So if we can harness that, we definitely were able to do more together. Other notable translations of this work is the school downstream did a crowdsourcing thing to raise more plants to plant further downstream. Another local conservation group, Fish and Game, fundraised an additional $500,000 to restore the branch next door. And what was also really meaningful was the partnership that I made with Mananui Ramsden, who represented local Kaitiaki, the indigenous sort of rights holders for the region, where we together would stand side by side and have open door farm visits with the farmer owner and operator, and open it to the community, where we would talk about shared vision around sustainability for the future. And so you can watch his YouTube video as well. So this kind of all leans back, like this partnership approach. I mean, a lot of the science that's growing and more research is coming out that just shows us that if we can do the science in a way that benefits and engages society, we have a greater chance of achieving sustainability. And some of the most notable examples are those, from Canada, where local Indigenous communities are engaged, in New Zealand, where we engage the local farming community, the government, the different agencies and authorities. And so those are, some of the reasons why they continue to be a key thread in the Healthy Headwaters Lab here in Windsor. And so I'll just pivot for this last little bit, the last half of my talk, to talk about what we're doing here at the Nature Conservancy property, MGNR, we call it, as well as it's knitted together across a network of partners, including farmers in Essex County. And pictured here are a whole bunch of soil cores that, despite the pandemic, were collected by our team, and including many of the people that are here on our call today. And so it's this idea that, what is the solution for Essex County? It's likely going to take a lot of different partnerships and a shared vision about what we can do together. And that's where Nature Conservancy Canada has been extremely supportive from the beginning. We can, their outdoor classroom with the presence of multiple, 2 different wetlands on the property, and they are sort of on a gradient towards conservation in natural spaces. So there's a number of students, some are here today to join us, where we're kind of piece by piece trying to understand and generate a local context about the soils, the farms, and the relationship with biodiversity here in Essex County. One of them is we use a lot of water quality analysis tools, such as this little this map, this 3D image map called Fluorescence, that allows us to almost fingerprint at each individual soil and water sample that we've collected across the county. And I think we have like 500 and counting. And it allows us also, by working in partnership, we're able to work on farm fields and MGNR, in the biodiversity, like looking at biodiversity on the farm field, in the riparian buffer, and in the agricultural drains. And so piece by piece, we're knitting together a number of research projects to understand, what is the potential for biodiversity and nature-based solutions in informing a lot of questions around climate change, sustainability of our agricultural drains, and in an agricultural landscape. So here's a number, just dots on a map, sites and individual farmers, and NCC, like places that we have been working in the last year. We've had a couple of different dedicated teams so we could do it safely, and thankfully with, farmers have been very gracious, and same thing with Nature Conservancy, to allow us to knit together an experimental design that embraces the local context. So embedded across all of these dots are farmers that are undertaking environmental practices or conservation practices on farms, and as well as others that aren't. MGNR and other natural spaces pictured here are they're part of that design. And then we're also doing a number of studies in the drains themselves, all the way from the city of Windsor across the county. So just for a couple of examples here, we have an undergraduate thesis student, as well as our lab storyteller, Cheyenne, who's looking to understand the nature of carbon in our drains from the city of Windsor all the way across the county, including the waterways that drain MGNR. We're trying to generate some baseline data around organic matter dynamics, invertebrate communities across this gradient. And we're hoping to use that to help inform, the potential for additional restoration or, conservation data that we hope to continue to build and grow. On the land, we have our master's student, Lauren, who has embraced, the reality of the agricultural landscape here in Essex to generate a gradient from conventional agriculture all the way to landscapes that are forested. We call them restored agriculture, because it turns out that they look very, they were once agricultural lands that have been converted. And so we're using our fingerprinting of the soils and the water to help determine how effective and how critically different are our soils across this gradient. So a lot of Swiss cheesing of Essex County happened this summer and into the fall. And so these are data that are continuing to build in the lab. And as you can imagine, because of the pandemic, it's sort of stop and go, and a little bit here and then go, and one team goes in. So it's been, I really do credit our team for finding creative ways to navigate this. And so just an idea, just a little bit about our fluorescence tool. It's a common tool used in things like sewage treatments. Like if you can fingerprint or generate a 3D map of the water or the soil, it tells you a lot about what's in there. And so there's lots of compounds that make organic carbon, and we're trying to create a regional model based on soil samples, tile drain water, and drain water to try and knit together a baseline for carbon, carbon stocks of the region. And this will hopefully inform how quickly does it take for conservation practices on farm to really shape and change the nature of our soil communities. And so that is linked to Emily Brown, who is another undergraduate student. She's also a recent youth awardee for the IRCA Conservation Awards this year. It's been a privilege for her to work. She's been working with Lauren, doing a lot of that boring and doing a lot of the lab work. And really, her work is situated on MGNR itself. Really understanding how soil and water in these conservation places, how distinct they are from our agricultural landscape. So we're looking not only in the wetland, we're looking in sediments, we're looking in agricultural fields adjacent into it. And with Cheyenne working in the buffer zones, we sort of have a nice spatial gradient about the nature of soil and its health and its link to the drains. And so so this is really having us rethink, what does biodiversity and nature in working landscapes mean? And so we're trying to generate a different types of, and just data sets around the potential for biodiversity as the solution. And I want to acknowledge our master's student, Ryan Graham, who's looking at these agricultural roadside ditches. We have more and more knowledge, like the example I showed you from New Zealand and other places around the world, that these might be, some really nice, some areas of potential for biodiversity, different types of plants and different types of relationships that might exist between the roadside vegetation and things like Phragmites. And so we're conducting a number of a series of surveys this summer across a number of gradients in Essex to quantify, identify, and understand the potential for biodiversity as being part of the solution for things like flood mitigation and invasive weeds and specifically Phragmites. And again, Nature Conservancy Canada's MGNR property is central to this, and he's also an intern with NCC as part of a newly launched graduate training program called Fishcast. So he'll be interning with NCC, looking at MGNR and other properties in the county where stewardship actions are needed. So hopefully this gives you an idea of our approach to restoring Great Lakes and really thinking about harnessing the real world opportunities for partnership and co-production to advance restoration from the land to the lake. I did want to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about freshwater biodiversity, because we do have our lab loves mussels, and not like the arm mussels, but freshwater mussels. And we've started to uncover rich, there's mussel communities in River Canard and a lot of these agricultural drains. And it's part of a larger project that we have in southwestern Ontario to understand the species at risk and mussel community conservation, integrated and integrated watersheds, agricultural watersheds here in Sydenham watershed, not too far from here. So, one of the things we think about is that mussels are sort of this one invertebrate species that kind of integrates everything. They stabilize habitat, they filter out water, and they release their glochidia into the drains, and they bind to certain fish hosts, and the fish hosts travel up and down waterways. And likewise, invertebrate communities are consuming and transferring energy up the food web. And so some of our graduate students are looking at how interactions across the trophic food web are essential for the conservation of freshwater mussel species at risk. And so, just watch the space. If, we have some really fun communications in and around what we're learning about the mussel communities. But again, it's in partnership with a number of different organizations, from conservation authorities to the federal government. I want to acknowledge our master's student, Roland, because he's looked at the restoration literature for mussels. And there's several studies, lots of studies, and more studies on things like freshwater mussels. But what's really interesting is here, the majority of the studies that he's looked at, only 37 of 1,337 actually document the success or not of restoration, actually measure what happens to mussel communities after restoration. So this sort of finding is really similar to a lot of restoration publications or studies that we've looked at. And so we're really hoping to, use our partnership network to try and understand the effectiveness of restoration and provide, advice or different ways of achieving shared goals around conservation. So I wanted to acknowledge that, we have another thesis student, Dante's looking at invertebrate communities at different locations throughout that watershed. And it's just, it's one of those species, if you're not looking for it and you're not elbow deep in the ditch, you just won't see those communities. And so we'll continue to do some of that work also here in Essex. So finally, I wanted to then also talk about what we've launched. Again, because of the pandemic, we would have had an in-person gathering, and this idea of creating a farm and freshwater ecology research network. It's really focused on thinking about restoration and question, sort of interrogating what is resistance and resilience. These are very resilient systems because they have, withstood a lot of, pressures. How can we use nature to address a lot of our carbon challenges and carbon solutions, using carbon as a solution to the challenges? And we think that biodiversity, particularly from the lens of the functions that they create, biodiversity corridors and things like that, are part of that solution. And so for that, I wanted to acknowledge some of our farmers who've been part of our team at different times, to help advise us and help us launch an advisory board. So we have seven different members, like farmers from here in Essex, including farmer representatives from Walpole Island, and this broader research network. And so we had a gathering called our Fab Night Out, and it's on YouTube, and you can see sort of little lightning talks from our different partners, as including Nature Conservancy Canada. So if you go to our website, you'll see our Fab Night Out post, and you're welcome to watch that for anyone that's interested to learn more about the farmer perspectives. And finally, like, it's been very important for our group to partner with our Indigenous rights holders. We have several people on our team who are expert and knowledge keepers. And so with all of our grants, we've dedicated funds to and dedicated mechanisms to ensure that research that we're doing at Walpole Island and in the general territory is also done in partnership. So as much as we have a partnership-led approach with our farming community, we take a very similar approach to embedding and creating spaces for us to really make sure the research that we're doing is amplifying and boosting capacity, capability, and just, making it central to everything we do. So with one of those examples of one of our best examples is our field course, which due to the pandemic didn't happen this past year, and will likely not happen this year again, but it was a wonderful space and place to bring students to look at species at risk. We looked at various plants, and one part of the day would be featured a faculty member looking at drones, or catching fish, and the evenings or the afternoon would be echoed by an elder knowledge keeper teaching us about traditions and history. So it was a wonderful opportunity to again embed the approach that our lab takes in the teaching. And one of our students created a video, so you're welcome to watch that. We have a newsletter for the community that continues to be another way that we remain connected. And so yeah, just watch this space, and we'd be obviously we're just really happy to share what we've learned and continue to build partnerships moving forward. So I wanted to end there and just simply say that, I'm happy to talk to you a lot about the science, but I think the partnerships and including meeting your group here tonight has been really important for the lab. We see it being so important for generating co-benefits and just getting conservation and restoration as a priority, and just sort of accelerating it in the community. So you can see there's different ways that we foster partnerships and we work strategically. And this is all because we know that conservation and restoration, great trajectories, it just takes time. And there's more and more research that shows, the social infrastructure that you need is necessary, especially if we want to monitor things for, decades long, or, really work at the timescales that are needed to build back nature. So I think I speak on behalf of my students and I when I say we need you. The one thing that we're missing is a biodiversity expert for plants. We're planning our survey, and we're going to be taking a lot of photos, and we're hoping to connect with, we'll use, iNaturalist and that kind of thing, but we are working locally. And so there's always opportunities for us. We might be finding different sites, and if you know a pocket or an area where, that you think might be interesting for us to look at, that we're always open and interested in hearing about that. We have our Fern and our Fab network. So if you're a farmer and you're interested in engaging in this advisory board, or if you have resources or connections that you think would be useful, again, we're also really interested in that. And as well as, we're always open to thinking about how this knowledge that our local community brings can inform our research, our scholarship, and our partnerships, specifically to find solutions that are made in Essex for Essex. So with that, I'd love to just plug the storytelling that's happening on our social media, I cannot take any credit at all. It's definitely been a group effort and a vision that Cheyenne, our undergrad and storyteller, has really just really helped harness. And I wanted to thank the students and our team members who are here tonight and also acknowledged in the presentation for their contributions to this as well. And I'm happy to take questions and just learn more from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, you're free to unmute yourself or add the question in the chat.
I guess I can ask a question. Am I unmuted now?
You're good, Jer.
I'm wondering how greenhouses will sort of fit into the future impact. A lot of it's moving towards greenhouse development, especially in Leamington and Kingsville, and just I know they have like retention ponds outside and maybe aspects that can be looked into for this kind of work. But yeah, I was just wondering how they fit into the research.
So we have OGVG, the Greenhouse Growers Association, as a member on our advisory board. I've only seen some of the preliminary data that some of those ponds offer, and it looks, it looks like some of the more naturalized wetland approaches might be more effective. And so I think I'm open. I mean, one of the reasons why MGNR is really useful is because of its proximity to the to the Leamington Trib and downstream. But I think so I think I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to include that in our network somehow. It's always been part, we don't want to ignore it, but I think, especially for this past year, we wanted to get a baseline, and a lot of the sites that we were able to access were based on which farmers were were comfortable with us accessing. So I think with time and over time, as people sort of get to understand some of how our baseline, that we're trying to generate this baseline and understand it. I definitely have samples through partnership from these different locations and wetlands. And as long as people are willing for us to sample, we draft individual, memoranda of understanding with each individual farmer, so that, and an operator, so that, everyone feels really comfortable with the fact that we're collecting these data. We never, it's not important to know who or what, because it's part of this larger story we're trying to knit. So yeah, the door is always open to really thinking about whether or not what their impact is. And so a lot of the value we bring to the table is like, well, if you're going to implement these mitigations or policies or these wetlands, let us measure them so we can at least have the data to inform it, because it's happening anyway. So I'd much rather so anyway, if there's ever an opportunity for us to find an owner operator who would want to include that as part of their study, we would welcome it. But we don't have it now. It is partially COVID, but it's always part of the vision that it would be included, and we're hoping to be part of that solution. So it really is about, at this point for this year, is to really try and generate the baseline data. So if you know any owner operators that would be interested in it, then we'd be interested in, again, our focus is the restoration. And if there are some nature-based solutions, we'd be interested in that. And so they've been really open. OGVG has been open they attend our meeting and listen and participate. So we do think about ways that we can work together.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
There's land near Windsor where they're looking to develop in wetlands. And I'm just thinking, like, big picture, long term, how could the type of research you're doing, perhaps assist not just with farming, but urban planning in these areas?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Cheyenne is one of the undergraduate students, so she's looking at like carbon processing rates in waterways that include City of Windsor drains and sites. So we've embedded that in our study. So I think we'll, again, because this was our baseline year, I'm pretty sure that the work that I didn't present actually was around work that I did in Maryland, where we looked at the effectiveness of things like urban wetlands and stormwater in, mitigating nutrients and things. So, there's a lot of different approaches that we take. And so if there's ever an opportunity to be at the table to offer those data and inform, but we also do have a partnership with City of Windsor to access Ojibwe Nature Park and the different waterways as part of that design as well. So we'll continue to do that. And I think one of the reasons why we like working at the community level is to really build up greater interest in, rethinking some of these human settled landscapes. Like, okay, wetlands are often not seen because they're on private land. So how can we make those stories visible? How can we, we can measure those data and include that. And so, yeah, there's just different ways right now that we're kind of dancing around, but I'm hoping that means that it'll bring the data to the conversation. And I do work with social scientists as well, because especially what we learned in New Zealand is that sometimes it wasn't just the science that was the key thing that made the difference. It might have been like a social approach or in a way that those information were shared or mobilized. And so we continue to do that. Like I have a research partner, and we're looking at how do you talk about nature solutions with people that don't already share those values, and how can that be embedded in the conversations, and how would you tailor target, where do people get their information? There's just lots of different things, which makes sense to me as an ecologist, but isn't normally how science is developed and applied. So yeah, so it is early days, but we have those projects coming online.
Great. Any other questions?
Oh, it's Linda. I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, this is very good. It seems like a very holistic approach, which it's a good thing. I know we tried about 10 years ago or so with the ministry and the local conservation authority to get farmers to put in riparian buffers along the streams, and they really did not want to participate because they didn't want to give up the land from farming. But my question is, well, it looks like this might be a little more successful in getting them to cooperate. My question is, in Lake Erie, the algae blooms are quite a problem. And I just wondered how your work, like, what are you investigating about this, doing about it, and how it's all connected? So I wish you would address that for a minute. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So one of the key tools we're using is that fluorometry tool, that 3D map. And what it does is it can allow us, and this is what, a lot of the work that is being done is really like downstream. A lot of the published work for algal blooms is in the actual river drain. It's like in the river itself, or once it gets into the lake, which is why we're kind of working from the other direction, working with the farmer to understand what is it that they're doing, if they have a conservation practice in place, if they're tile, and we've chosen farms that actually have a tile drain going to the roadside drain. And what we're trying to do is actually use our fingerprinting tool to understand the transport and fate of carbon as it's being applied, because carbon is really the base of a lot of the key conservation practices, whether it be cover cropping, tillage regime, amendments, those sorts of things. Like they all have a unique signature. And so by creating this regional model, we actually, and using the gradient and with these different overlapping projects, we're essentially fingerprinting from farm field to the tile drain into the river space what kind of carbon that binds to things like phosphorus in the waterway. And this is just, I think it adds a complementary bit of data, because there are many farmers that are trying to do things to invest in carbon on the soil, but for various reasons. So there's a number of ways that we're getting at it. Is number one, trying to trace it from farm field to the drain. Secondly, measuring. Right now we have students and staff and members of our team measuring in the winter, because that tends to be another knowledge gap. And there's a lot of research from some of our collaborators at Waterloo that suggests that's when a lot of phosphorus is running off the landscape. And so while we do know the solutions, what we hope to offer is kind of the missing link in the puzzle piece between understanding if something worked and if something didn't. And we think and there's, the one common currency is carbon. And so we have a number of tools that allow us to well and truly fingerprint it and show to the farmer, this is what a 20-year no tillage regime cover cropping farm looks like at zero, from the tile. And so that's kind of our kind of decentralized approach to doing that. But ultimately, this is also why we're trying to work with farmers or lands across, broader gradients. If someone has wetlands like MGNR, we can actually document, and show with our data, like how well it does work. And I think what also makes it possibly helpful and that's really for the decision maker to decide, is that because we have a gradient of farm fields that are doing full plow all the way to those that are conservation lands, the different, yeah, which are technically, you know, forested or post restoration by, you know, on the scale of decades. I'm hoping what we can actually show is a timeline for restoration to say, if you do no tillage or if you plant a forest, this is what it does for soil and carbon. And I think that's one of the reasons why restoration is often challenged, because a lot of these projects are only monitored for maybe 1 year or two, you know, or only downstream. And so I think we're trying to create and generate data to help provide a realistic picture of why it's important to do these things. You know, the best time to do and engage in conservation actions are now, or 20 years ago, but the next best time is now. And so if you do something now, what will that look like in 3 years? Well, we have a site like that, and we have a spatial coverage like that. And so that's kind of one way that we're trying to be helpful to that solution. But that being said, we also, one thing I didn't talk about, another tool we use is literature synthesis. So we draw on global data sets like that freshwater mussel one that I showed you. And we currently are working on informing the provincial government, working under the LEAP, like OMAFRA and things like that, because they're interested in our literature review related to biodiversity and best management practices for southwestern Ontario. So it's just a multi-pronged approach. Yeah, and I'm hoping that those will all help inform and bolster, either whether it be, you know, we like to know who the modelers are, because if our data are useful, take it, you know, we'd like to know, you know, understand what the farmers are doing. So if there is something that's working well, we can document that, and we want to understand what are those levers. We actually even partner with the drain superintendents. If there are any drain superintendents out there that are interested in doing something different, you know, then, or allowing us to monitor what their practice, what the result of their practice is, you know, those are the sorts of things that we hope to the data that we hope to bring to light to inform better, more informed decision making, I suppose.
Great. Any other questions?
Catherine, I have a comment more than a question, and that is I'm really looking forward to looking at the recording of your presentation, because you cover so much ground and there's so many things that you talk about that for a lot of us lay people, we need to kind of think about it, look it up, understand it, educate ourselves a little bit, and then possibly ask additional questions down the way to people who might be able to help us understand things better. So thank you for presenting this. I'm looking forward to watching it again.
Thank you. And I invite you to go to the website, because we do have like, we have a number of resources, and for every paper that might come out, there's a plain language summary. There's even video content, and that's by design. And you know, we even have our Healthy Headwaters Lab like tip sheets that include watershed monitoring protocols for high school students and things like that. And so I'm hoping today you kind of got a flavor of the different types of projects, because whether it be carbon or farming that you're interested in, or species at risk, or even partnership approaches, or even New Zealand, like, oh, I'm hoping like that's a nice landing page that you know is purposely diverse. And I completely acknowledge that I'm often overwhelming, and that's just I understand that, but we're just really excited to be here today, because this is a group that we're hoping to learn from more. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic, and we'll be definitely sharing your website and all the links to make it easy for everybody to access. So yeah, this is great. I see that there's a comment here that you're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, so you're on all the platforms, and that's monitored. So yeah, we can definitely send people there to have questions as questions come up in the future. But
Yeah,
I think we'll definitely have to keep you in touch here, you know, keep you involved, and coming back as you know, as you have more findings, we'd definitely be interested in seeing you know, ongoing.
Yeah, maybe we can all go for a walk together soon. You know, that's sort of our favorite thing, is to walk and talk, and it doesn't matter, you know, what the weather is, or, you know, if it's a farm, or if it's, you know, along the river, or, you know, under a forest, like anywhere, we just love the walk and talk. So anytime you'd love to do that, we're always open for that.
That's perfect. We will definitely.
I think Ryan's looking for field assistance as well. he's going to be scouring agricultural drains this summer and that sort of thing. So there's always options.
Yeah, we have a
Or do
lot of
we
people who have
apply for
been-
that job on the website, Catherine? How do we? We got lots of
Yeah.
people here who like to get outside, so.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we'd love to engage that. Like, yeah, just send us, yeah, any way you want to get in touch. It all kind of comes together in the end. So, yeah, we'll organize some surveys and we have comms and things like that. So people are always up to the loop.
I'll
Perfect.
have to make a group so I can send a random photo on
Yeah.
Wednesday when I'm out in the field, because I can't identify this one grass
That's
that
right.
somebody might know. We'll have to figure that out.
Yeah, that's right.
We probably have somebody that can help you out, so definitely do
And
it.
and it's so true. I mean, even our mussel team, it would be like rock or mussel, and we're like, which one? And we just like take photos and share photos of what we find. And I feel like it's going to be a similar thing with our riparian biodiversity surveys.
That's great. Any other questions for now? Like I said, we'll definitely be sharing all the information, and
Thank
it'll be easier to get if you have any follow-up questions later on. We'll have all the contact info on the channels and be easier to find. So I
Yeah.
just want to say on behalf of the club, thank you very much for taking the time tonight. It was a fantastic presentation. The lab is doing a lot of fantastic work, so
We're
definitely
trying.
it's been fantastic. So thank you again for taking the time, and we'll hope to see you soon, and we'll be out
Yeah,
there.
we'll see you soon. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.
That concludes the presentation for tonight, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.